So once again, welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Truby. I am the Habitat Conservation Manager with Sky Island Alliance. Sky Island Alliance's offices are in Tucson, Arizona, which is the traditional land of the Tohono O'odham, Pasquayaki, and other indigenous peoples. Right now, my colleague Anna will be posting in the chat more details about the land that we are guests on and that we are very honored to be able to explore. Today, we're going to hear all about snails. Maybe snails might not be the first thing that you think about when you're thinking about the desert, but we actually have more than 200 different species in Arizona alone. So really quickly, what I'd like to do is frame why it is that we're asking about snails and why we're really excited to learn more about snails here. As many of you know, we have a program called Spring Seeker here at Sky Island Alliance. It requires only a smartphone. You can either take the survey in English or Spanish. It takes about 10 minutes. And all we're asking folks to do is go out when you're on your day hikes or your overnight hikes or whatever it might be, and just catalog the water sources that you find out there. We are interested in making sure that wildlife has safe passage through this entire Sky Island region, and knowing where the water is really important for that. One of the questions that we ask is actually about snails. Oh, that's interesting. Anyway, we ask a question about snails. Our question is very basic right now. It just says, do you see snails at the spring? Are they large snails or small snails? And then you can add more details in the chat or in the about box. So we obviously need a little bit more training about snails. And so I am absolutely delighted to introduce Jeff Sorensen. Jeff Sorensen is the Invertebrate Wildlife Program Manager, or Snail Guy, at Arizona Game Fish Dept. He started with the State Wildlife Agency 31 years ago, working on various fisheries and riparian projects across Arizona. Over the years, Jeff has helped monitor and manage the Kanab ambersnail in the Grand Canyon and dozens of other mollusks, including most of our springsnail species. So as a reminder, during the talk, please stay muted, and we will feel free to type any questions in the chat. We'll keep track of those. And then at the end, we'll have time for Jeff to answer all those questions. So I'd like to pass it off to you now, Jeff, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Now, can you guys see this? I know most of you are muted. Somebody said, okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So let me start with first a little bit of history here. So snails are one of the oldest life forms that are on the planet. As a taxon, they have been here for 500 million years. So they were here before the dinosaurs. They outlived the dinosaurs, one of the most successful group of animals on this planet. And surprisingly, they have survived several mass extinction events. This is as a taxon group. So they are very good at surviving all sorts of climate change, all sorts of big impacts, whether they're short-term or long-term. And what's interesting is throughout their tenure, they have remained essentially unchanged in form and function. If you look in the fossil record, they look like snails. Now, simply put, they're recyclers. They convert dead and dying plant material into plant food. And another big part of their function is to provide a food source for a lot of other animals. So that's unfortunately their lot in life. They get eaten by a lot of animals, birds, herps, fish, even other invertebrates. So, but they have been very, very successful in their long tenure on this planet. Now, why do we care? A lot of wildlife management is driven by human values. And we currently have several laws and rules, federal and state, in place. Everybody's familiar with the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, but these are ones that we manage all of our wildlife species, and they change over time. Prior to 1969, 1973, we didn't have the Endangered Species Act in its current form. So human values will change over time. Currently, these are what we have in place. So we value our wildlife, especially our non-game species, and we do that extra steps to help ensure that they remain out there on our landscapes and are protected. So we have a state a wildlife action plan. That's a large overview strategic document. That way we work with our partners, and that includes the both federal, county, municipal, as well as, private landowner, land management agencies, a lot of non-governmental entities as well. So that kind of is our large blueprint on how we manage, wildlife around the state. Now, specific to crustaceans and mollusks, we have that underneath our fishing regulations under what we call Game and Fish Commission Order 42. And that regulates what you can and can't do as far as harvesting snails and crayfish. So, and for researchers, we have scientific collecting licenses as well. So we manage, rare species and say, hey, here's how many you might be able to take, and these are our concerns. So across Arizona, we have about 200, probably more than that, species of mollusks that are native in the state. That's amazing, since this is a very dry, arid state, that we have so many different species of mollusks, snails or slugs, clams, even freshwater mussels, the California floater. And as you can see on this map here, we have spring snails and land snails all throughout the state. And as I tell our wildlife managers, our game wardens, wherever they get posted, they're going to have some mollusk of interest in their areas that they're going to be working. So pretty much in everybody's backyard. Now, here's a fairly long list of mollusks that we consider to be species of greatest conservation need. And we have active monitoring and management efforts going on right now. Now, that involves the Niobrara ambersnail. Kanab ambersnail was recently delisted because it was found to be more alike to the Niobrara ambersnail, both genetically and morphologically. So, but we have pretty much all of our spring snail species in the state, which is 13 described species and 3 undescribed. So many of those, as well as a number of land snails. There are talussnails or mountain snails. And like I said, we have one freshwater mussel called the California floater, which is perhaps our most rare and at risk of becoming extirpated from the state. But all of the ones you see here with little asterisks behind them, those are all being managed and monitored under existing conservation agreements. And so we work very closely with a lot of our partners as well as our NGOs. Now, we've really stepped up our game in the last 6 years. We're doing a lot more survey work, inventory, and a lot more training, just like this workshop, this presentation. And so we've added a number of other spring snails around the state that we're doing more active monitoring management to try to get a better sense of their status and distribution. Same thing with the talussnails, including the Huachuca woodland snail. And as you can see in some of these images, our snail fauna is really neat. Various types of shells and sizes, and just the habitats they live in. It's really quite remarkable. So I'll go ahead and jump into describing some of those. So for those of you that are doing springs monitoring and inventory, spring snails are going to be one of the primary mollusks that you're really going to be wanting to look for. We have freshwater snails of the genus Pergolopsis and Trionia. They are very small. Think of smaller than a sesame seed. So they're quite hard to find. Most of the folks have overlooked them in times past. So spring snails have separate sexes. So the females tend to be larger than the males. They're short-lived. They live about a year. And as I said, we have 13 described species of Pergolopsis and at least 3 Trionia. So the Trionia look very similar to mud snails, and we got to be careful on that. That's why having some voucher specimens and being able to run genetics is really important. Arizona is still kind of a frontier. As you can see in this map from a scientific article by Hirschler and others, our neighboring states, California, Nevada, Utah, there are a lot of Pergolopsis spring snail populations that have been documented in those states. In Arizona, it's a big blank spot in a lot of our areas. And that's partly because we do not have a very systematic effort looking for these tiny snails in a lot of our springs. And that's where you guys will be able to help us a lot when you're out exploring Arizona and you come across these springs. Look for these tiny snails. And if you see some, photographs or even specimens would be really valuable for us. So you can kind of help fill in a lot of those blank spaces. Now, a lot of the springs, a lot of our waters around the state do have very common species of aquatic snails. The pond snail that you see on the right here, Those are very cosmopolitan in their distribution. That means they're habitat generalist. And that's great because they're a big food source for a lot of our fish and wildlife out there. So that makes up a good part of the food base for them. And they happen to be very good at re-establishing in places that have been disturbed, either through flooding or drought, fire impacts, or livestock, or something like that. So on the left here, you can see the ram's horn snails, or planorbidds. They tend to be a little bit larger, and we have both native and non-native planorbid species. Unfortunately, we don't have good records about when they might have gotten into the state. And so a lot of malacologists haven't really been able to definitively say, well, these could be native or they could be introduced. But most of the planorbidds tend to be fairly good. Again, they're part of the food base. A lot of waterfowl will feed on them, mud turtles and such, including some fish, some of our native suckers. So now spring snails tend to be very tiny, as I said. In fact, they're about the size of FDR's ear on the US dime. And so you can see that the differences in shell shapes. Spring snails, they whirl to the right, while our pond snails whirl to the left. So if you have a snail that's in the flat of your palm and it's like trying to get away from you, you can look at that last whirl and which way it kind of turns. Now, identifying spring snail habitat. There's quite a bit of springs out there and seeps. They vary drastically as far as the type of habitat that's available. So on the right here, you can see some of our springs up in the White Mountains that support the endangered three-forked spring snail. They tend to be open grassy alpine meadows with some rocky substrate, as well as watercress or other spring dominant vegetation. Other locations around the state might be modified, through spring boxes or channeled or something like that. So the image on the left is actually one of our springs that's been modified at Page Springs Hatchery, and it tends to have a lot more silt. But generally, our spring snails, especially the Pergolopsis, really like the hard substrates. They rely on the rocks, pebbles, sticks, and leaf litter for substrate to live on, to lay their eggs, as well as to forage. What they'll do is they'll graze along the surfaces of those hard substrates, and they'll eat the periphyton or the biofilm that grows on there. So they're busy grazing, the diatoms and algal film that might occur on those type of hard substrates. They tend to like slower flowing water, not really fast, swift stuff. And they tend to be very, very close to the spring heads or spring vents. We don't usually find them much further than usually a few meters downstream of a spring head. So now switching from our aquatic snails to our larger talussnails. And I want to emphasize this because as you guys explore Arizona and go out to these sites, you're going to be hiking in past rocky habitats or other, wooded meadows and stuff like that. You might encounter some of these larger land snails, and those are of great interest to us as well because we just don't know enough about our populations. And so talussnails are one of our largest snails that we have that are native to Arizona, and they're the genus Sonorella, which takes its name from the Sonoran Desert. So they tend to be about nickel size generally. They're kind of flat, discoidal. And the thing that really kind of distinguishes them is they have this brown stripe around their outer whorl, or what we call a shoulder band stripe. And they tend to have just a single brown stripe. So now these snails are hermaphroditic. So that means, they have both male and female genitalia. And when they mate, they exchange gametes and go on their own way. So that should also help make them pretty good colonizers as well. And similar to our spring snails, they will feed on a lot of the stuff that's nearby in their habitats. In this case, these guys will feed on the moss and fungus, bacteria, and detritus, decaying plant material. Sometimes they'll even eat some of the young, fresh vegetation that might be nearby. I want you to think of talussnails a lot like our desert tortoises. They spend a lot of their time resting, so they're estivating for months at a time. And they typically come out after it rains. When the weather is much cooler, there's lots of moisture and humidity and stuff like that. But these talussnails also tend to be very long-lived. They typically live for about 4 to 6 years, some perhaps as much as a decade. So they live in among the rocky talus slopes and under boulders, rocky piles, base of cliffs, and they will spend most of their lives living deep underground in those interstitial spaces where the temperatures are much cooler and there's more higher humidity, moisture levels underground. Like I said, they get those environmental clues when it starts to get, after those rain events, and they'll come out. That's when they'll be busy rehydrating, foraging, and then finding mates. Now, there are about 80 species of talussnails throughout Arizona, which is pretty remarkable. In fact, I suspect that there's a number of new species out there that are being described. And I'm working with a colleague of mine, Nick Waters, who actually developed this kind of mini poster. He's identified some species around the state that he's working with a malacologist and geneticist to try to get those published for new species identifications. So location is one of the big things we need to know about where these things are, so we can help with identifying who they might be. Because as you can see, they look a lot alike. They're very, very similar.
Amazing.
Now, we also have mountain snails and woodland snails. These are the mountain snails, the genus Oreohelix. They tend to be fairly common from the southeastern part of the state up through the Mogollon Rim area, in eastern Arizona as well, and then all the way through northern Arizona, up into the canyon country, across the Navajo Reservation, in those rocky habitats. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of our mountain snails is they tend to have a double brown stripe on its outer whorl. The younger snails tend to have more of a sharpened keel on the edge, which is very noticeable. You can kind of see the sharpened keel on this one image here of one of the younger mountain snails. Now the Oreohelix are neat in that they will actually hatch their young inside them. So their eggs actually develop inside the snail, and then they'll hatch baby snails. And so I've made some collections of Oreohelix in the past, and what I thought I had 3 in my sample container, when I got them back home and then looked at them, I suddenly realized I had 6. I had 3 young ones, and because they had birthed a couple of young snails while the time I collected them in the field and brought them back to keep them. So those are pretty neat. We're now just starting to learn more about our woodland snails, the ashmonellas. And so I've been spending a lot of time down in the Huachucas. I would like to spend more time in eastern Arizona in the Blue Mountain Range, as well as up in the Mogollon Rim. That's where the ashmonella also occur, and the Chiricahua Mountains. So we have several species of ashmonella as well. So those are pretty unique species, and they tend to be more found in the oak woodland type habitat, especially among a lot of leaf litter. Now, we have several introduced species of snails in the state, and many of these have come in through garden landscaping plants, so ones that you buy at the nurseries and bring them, or other folks in your neighborhood may have those planted, and they hitchhike in, and that's how we ended up with brown garden snails, as well as the decollate snails. And you can see, these look different enough from our talussnails and our mountain snails. Now, we're concerned about these because as introduced species, they might bring in parasites or pathogens. They might compete for shelter and other food resources, or in the case of the decollate snail here on the right, they're predatory. The decollate snail will actually track onto the slime trails of slugs and snails and chase it down and then attack that snail or slug, use it as a food. So we've documented at least 2 locations where decollate snails coexist with some of our native talussnails. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens to those native talussnail populations. So even if you're in around your neighborhood and you're finding these type of snails, it's still very good to document those and let us know. We're especially interested in any places in the wild where you might see these. So how to identify land snail habitat? Like I said, as you're hiking out to locations where springs may be, you're going to be passing a lot of rocky habitat, perhaps some talus slides, or up in the high country, on the mountaintops, vegetated areas as well. These are all prime areas where snails live. And while the weather tends to be fairly hot and dry most of the year, again, those snails will be hunkered down deep, hiding in their interstitial spaces or hibernacula. But after the rains, that's when these things will come up to the surface and be active. And we've encountered that down in the Huachucas in Ramsey Canyon, where one day we gotten on our hike up to look at a springsnail site, and we found over 100 talussnails and dozens of the ashmonella woodland snails right along the trail. And a year later, we came back under dry conditions, and we did not see a single talussnail shell. So that was kind of remarkable, even though we knew that was a very robust population there. We did find a few of the woodland snail shells, but that was a big contrast between what we know lives there to what we might find while we're hiking in drier conditions. So land snails can occur everywhere from high elevation to low elevation. Although most of our woodland and forested talussnails and mountain snails, they tend to be about 6,000 foot elevation and above. And so as you hit the Sky Islands, pretty much that 6,000 foot elevation is your kind of your mark where you're going to start seeing those talussnails and mountain snails and woodland snails. But we do have talussnails that occur at lower elevations. In fact, the Phoenix area, a lot of our mountain ranges and mountain preserves will have the Phoenix talussnail, as well as there's places elsewhere around the Tucson Basin, like at White Hill, where we had the Sound Opera talussnail that are low elevation. So I'd like to talk about threats to our native snail populations. Now, loss of habitat, either through development, mining, or rock and gravel quarries, these tend to be fairly permanent losses of habitat, and especially can impact a lot of our land snails, as well as some of our spring snail populations. So, and working with the cities and counties, land management agencies, private landowners, if we can maintain some of those wild spaces for these snails, we can help ensure that they stay around longer. We also have a loss of habitat when it comes to groundwater and the modification and development from springs, especially for spring snails, where it's, they have to be in the water and they need that water. So our continuing mega drought is a big concern. Now, the modified springs, this has been one of those situations where even if there's an old spring box or the water has been piped and modified from that spring, there's still a chance you might be able to find spring snails in those locations. Most of our spring snail populations at Page Springs and Bubbling Ponds Hatchery have been modified historically. So long before the Arizona Game Fish Commission purchased those hatcheries, those areas had already been modified. And yet we still have over 10 populations that are doing quite well for spring snails, even though we still have a lot of spring boxes or modified springs. So as long as there's still water and habitat for them, we can still have those springs persisting. I'll be working with our amphibians reptiles program and our landowner relations and development crew on providing some guidance as far as when they do water development projects. And this will be helpful for our project evaluation folks and our regional habitat specialists, with some guidance on if they are doing a water development project, how can they still maintain enough habitat for our non-game species, whether they're mollusks or they're amphibians, reptiles, or fish that might be in those areas. And so hopefully that type of guidance will be helpful and bring us more current to how we may be able to share these resources with all of our wildlife. Now, a lot of you are familiar with our problem with aquatic invasive species, crayfish and exotic snails. Now, crayfish tend to be very, very voracious and adaptable, and we find them in many of our waters. I'm working with a graduate student and his professors on a study of crayfish distribution and status through Arizona and New Mexico, primarily the Gila River Basin. And additional studies have been done by Arizona State University and NAU, U of A as well. And TNC has been a big partner in the past, helping us identify where crayfish may be and what their status is. So our invasive snails, New Zealand mud snail is one that's starting to become more of a problem in our state, as we find them are now expanding from just the Colorado River system. We knew that they occur in the White River, as well as now in Oak Creek. So we do find apple snails, the genus Bomacea. They're from the aquarium trade. And so somebody's unwanted aquarium pets have been illegally released into the wild, and they have been established along the Salt River and a lot of our canal systems around the Phoenix area, including a lot of our urban lakes. So I'm also kind of working with the Scottsdale Community College. I'm trying to do some research on those, as well as working with Odyssey Aquarium, Sea Life Aquarium, Tonto National Forest, the City of Phoenix, and others to try to, keep tabs on what's going on with them and maybe do, some targeted removal efforts where we might encounter them. So now, not only do these invasive and non-native snails and crayfish, do they compete for the same resources, but they also might predate on. In the case of apple snails, they'll tend to eat the eggs as well as young pond snails or planorbid snails, and crayfish are voracious. They'll eat everything that they can get their hands on. So additional threats include sedimentation from trampling and overgrazing by livestock, whether they're feral burros and horses, or actually cattle operations, from ranching. That's not to say that responsible use by ranchers is going to be an impact. It just needs to be managed properly for these sensitive habitats. So, and we do have a few options available to us, whether enclosing the springs or at least, working with the landowners to ensure that we can maintain that habitat for those species. Wildfires have been one of the larger emerging threats over the last couple decades. Our fires tend to be larger and they burn hotter. So that means we have more affected soils, a lot more erosion, especially when we get summer or winter rains. And then the habitat becomes degraded, not only for land snails, but also for spring snails. A lot of the silt will fill in the habitats that normally would be flushed by springs. That can affect the water quality, as well as filling in those hard substrates that the snails will need. So, but surprisingly, some of the wildfire effects on our native snails, both talussnails and springsnails, have shown that our snails tend to be fairly resilient to even these impacts. We thought we had lost 2 populations of Pergolopsis spring snail up in the Bradshaws after the Goodwin fire. And just last October, 5 years after that Goodwin fire, we found that all of those populations were still extant. They were still there, even though they, some of the springs suffered some very severe erosion. They had scoured out almost about 5 feet of topsoil in one drainage. And it was amazing that we found over 100 spring snails at the spring head 5 years later. So I haven't written the book off on a lot of those populations just yet. And it just sometimes takes time to find them, after these type of impacts. So more research is needed on a lot of our native snails. Like I said, we have about 200 or so, and many of them, it's kind of an open book. We just don't know enough about them. In fact, the IUCN Red List, NatureServe, a lot of them are very data deficient. And so we're trying to help kind of close the gap there by getting new records and being able to share that information. And our HDMS staff are busy working with NatureServe, try to update their files periodically. And so this is where you guys can help us out as you come across our snails in the wild, whether at springs or on the trails or nearby land snails. More records will certainly help us fill in those data gaps. And over the past 6 years, we have discovered 19 new spring snail populations around the state. We really have focused more on trying to get out, visit sites, and train others. And so a number of these locations where populations have been discovered, our partners have done that. From Sky Islands Alliance to the Park Service, Forest Service, our folks with BLM. They've been able to document new locations. We've been able to go out, do surveys, and confirm those. We recently have a new journal article that was peer-reviewed, identifying and verifying what spring snails we have around the state from these new populations. So we use genetics to identify those. We also determined that we have 3 undescribed Pergolopsis species that I'm hoping to work with the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley professor and her students to formally identify those through journal publication. So. We have also added a bunch of new land snail records. While we're out there visiting sites around the state and working with like Pima County and others, we've been able to, on the trails or off trails, been able to document where these things are occurring and actually do surveys where we can kind of get an assessment of their habitat and relative abundance of their populations. So we've really kind of added a lot more records. So what are the conservation needs for our native snails? First and foremost, protect and maintain their habitat. Second, if we can reduce any of their threats or manage those threats. And one of my big roles with the Game and Fish Department is to work with our partners to protect those species and their habitats under land management plans or conservation agreements. Arizona's had a tremendous success with conservation agreements, working for a number of spring snails and land snails over the years. So, and of course, I work closely with a lot of our academic and NGO partners to do additional research and find new populations. So I really want to give a shout out to the Phoenix Zoo Conservation Center. They've done a remarkable job on helping us learn a lot more about spring snails and being able to propagate those in the wild, or propagate those in captivity. And then now we're actually at the point where we're able to translocate them back into the wild. So they were definitely doing a lot of groundbreaking work. And the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum is going to be working with us very soon on trying to get a population of Quito trionia there from Organ Pike National Monument. So our conservation agreements are very involved as far as there's several components to them. We have the signed conservation agreement, and these are voluntary agreements with the land management agency or landowner, whether they're private or a federal, county, state, or city. And then we have annual work group meetings where we kind of provide updates, feedback, and we plan out what activities we might be doing, whether it's just strictly monitoring or survey efforts, or actually something more active, some habitat protection or enhancement, or perhaps even locations. And we use 5-year action plans to help with our workload and for funding requests into the future. And then we document the work that we did every year in annual progress reports. We provide a lot of really good documentation, not only to our partners, but to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so that way we can say, hey, we're actively doing work for these species protected under conservation agreements and conservation plans. And so we've been successful in the last 5 years for implementing this work for the Huachuca spring snail and a whole host of Pinaleno land snails, talussnails, mountain snails, and even these tiny little snaggletooth snails. So some people ask, well, how do you study snails? What's involved in the surveys? For spring snails, and actually, for the most part, all of our land snails or spring snails will do a presence detection survey. So it's kind of a presence app. Go out to a site if it's new for the first time, and we'll start searching for a certain time frame. For spring snails, usually there isn't a lot of wet habitat. So within about 20 minutes, if we haven't been able to find them, chances are they're probably not there, or their population is so rare that it's going to be functionally extirpated. Spring snails tend to be very abundant when we typically find them in most locations. Once we do have them documented that they're present, we'll do a time count. And we've tried in the past using area-based and randomized subsamples or quadrant sampling. We hit a lot of 0 data points, unfortunately. But now what we do is we look at the spring head and we work our way downstream or down the channel from that spring run or spring habitat. And then we'll do some transects along the way. And what we'll do is we'll do a timed search looking at all the hard substrates, leaf litter, into the silt or the gravel or pebbles. And then from that, we can generate a catch per unit effort estimate. That gives us a relative abundance. And over time, we can use that catch per unit effort estimate as a benchmark to see what that population might be doing, so to determine some trends from season to season, from year to year, or even among sites for the same species. So if we want to do a density estimate, we can use sample tiles. We'll put those tiles out there, come back several months later. Those tiles will be covered with a biofilm, a periphyton and diatoms. and it'll actually attract the snails to forage on those. And we can pick up those tiles and more accurately count how many snails are on there, since we have a known estimate of the size, that area, that sample tile. But while we're out there, similar to what the work that you guys are doing for habitat associations, we try to document what is the spring or seep like, what lives there. We try to, identify, are there other invertebrates that are living there? Are there amphibians, reptiles that might be found, or fish? Are there any crayfish or aquatic invasive species in there? What's the substrate like? How much vegetation can we identify the vegetation, species that occur within the spring that the snails might use? And we try to characterize the spring flow. We generally have to do a lot of that qualitatively because the springs or seeps tend to be so shallow that we can't use a flow meter, or they're so choke full of leaf litter or watercress, it's hard to actually get some type of measurement to the flow over a distance of time. But it works for us. And so we do adopt some of the stuff that the Spring Stewardship Initiative or Institute have used and provided for us. But we also do a point-in-time threat assessment. And this is something I've been trying to get my colleagues with Game and Fish on the other projects, Fish and Herps, to try to do while they're actually visiting the site, is take a look around, what are the various stressors that might be happening to this habitat and to our snail populations at that point in time. And then take lots of photos, so that those photos, you can take repeat images of that habitat and see over time, what might be happening. If we're having impacts from trampling, from feral burrows or livestock, or if there have been flooding impacts post-fire or something like that. Our land snail surveys, we try to focus those searches right after it rains. So when the weather conditions are very damp and humid, that's when the best time to find these guys are active. Now, if we don't have very wet weather like this winter, it's been tough to get out and do land snail surveys because it just hasn't rained much. But that doesn't stop us from getting out and go looking, because we might be able to find the shells out there on the habitat. And the shells will last in the environment for many years, perhaps decades. And so the shells will tend to be kind of bleached out. You might not have the same pigmentation. You might not be able to see the shoulder band stripes, but that's still evidence that there is a population that lives there. And the more shells you find, the more likely that's a robust population, but not always. So we're still learning in that. So our land snail survey protocols, we have a lot of basic information about land ownership, obviously the georeferenced location, but we really want to know what the weather's doing. And when was the last rain event? And if it's, under wet conditions, try to capture the air temperature, relative humidity, how much rain did we have? And then of course, our time. What time did we start searching? What time did we end? That gives us our effort. And then of course, capture, how many shells one might see, whether, if we can tell whether they're mature or juvenile. We haven't really kind of pinned that down yet as far as what's the difference between, a sub-adult to, a fully adult, but obviously, the smaller shells for the land snails tend to be juveniles. So we do have to kind of clean up our protocol a little bit more on that. But we also want to take a look at what type of rock type, and then the aspect and slope. So are we on a northwestern flank of the mountain, which might retain a bit more moisture? Is the slope too gentle? Is it a gentle slope, or is it pretty severe? What's the more likelihood that some of those interstitial spaces are going to get filled in? And then look at the vegetative canopy cover. How much vegetation might be, whether it's shrubby habitat or tree cover. And elevation, if you can get the elevation as well. That's very important, especially for our woodland and forest land snails. So, and then here you can see a number of stressors that we have that we try to identify, whether we know about them or we can observe them and photograph them. That's where having land managers coming out with us, being able to tell us, oh yeah, this site had livestock grazing how many years ago, or at least annually or something, for that type of impact, or maybe these roads got closed off to off-highway vehicle use, or they can identify invasive plants that are coming into the landscape, whether it's stink net or red brome or any of those type of problem species. So now to wrap up my presentation, I'd like to talk about one of the big tools that citizen science and any user can use. iNaturalist is a fantastic app. It's free. You can add it to your iPhone or Android, smartphones or tablets. It's a wonderful tool for you to be able to document with photographs, as well as be able to georeference that location. They're very easy to use. For land snails, I request that folks take pictures of our snails and the habitat, and to join the project called Land Snails of Arizona. We also have the HDMS, which is our NatureServe link for Arizona. So those records are very useful for us to be able to document where they occur on the landscapes, and we can verify those based on the images you take. And when you take pictures of snails, it's best to try to get multiple shots of the snail. Make sure the photos are nice and crisp and clear. And if you can, try to have something of scale. I usually put a coin down next to my photos of the snails, so that way you can take a look at the snail size based on a penny or dime. Or if you don't have something like that, just use the end of a pen or pen. That way we can kind of get a rough estimate of the size. And then take a picture of the habitat, a wide area of the habitat that area looks like, because that's useful for us to know what type of, it's like, oh, I can tell from that photo the tree canopy or shrub canopy, or I can see kind of the slope of what that area is like, and what type of habitat, whether it's a talus slide or just rocky, like on a cliff face or hillside. And then of course, the spring itself, is it a modified spring with a spring box? Is there a lot of hard substrate or leaf litter in that spring? So, and for our land snails, we like to know what the weather's been doing, especially. So make sure your photographs have the georeferencing tag open and accessible to the public. And then if you don't know what it is, feel free just to put down a gastropod or a snail. Other users out there in the iNaturalist community, and myself as a curator for Land Snails of Arizona project, will look at those images and be able to tell you based on that location what it might be. And so that'll be really helpful for us. And if you do find aquatic snails, you can send me the images, or feel free to post them to the Land Snails of Arizona. I can help you with that as well, whether they're pond snails or spring snails or something similar. So, but I thank you very much. I really hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and you've learned a little bit more about our mollusk of Arizona. We have a remarkably rich biodiversity of desert snails. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. It's so cool to learn about all the different species that we have here and how to identify some of them. I, for one, am very excited for the next time I go out to a spring, and then anytime I go out hiking near rocky areas, I'm going to keep a closer eye out for those. I have a couple questions to start us off as folks are putting their questions in the chat. The first is actually related to taking photographs. Is it okay to pick up a spring snail long enough to take a picture? Or
yes,
okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. Our snails are very resilient. You can actually handle them for a while. The spring snails, just don't keep it out of the water too long. The Pergolopsis and the Trionia, they have an operculum, so they seal themselves up to prevent desiccation. But with the hot, dry summer weather, just try to keep them wet, or at least get them back in the water as soon as you can. Our land snails are used to being out crawling around, and then wherever you pick them up, just make sure they go back to where you found them. So.
Very cool. We have a question from Paula, which is, are there any reintroduction efforts in springs with extirpated species?
Yes, this last year, it was our first year to actually try to repatriate or to establish new populations in the wild. Working with the Phoenix Zoo Conservation Center, they have a captive population of the Huachuca spring snail, and working with John Clark with the Sierra Vista Ranger District, Coronado National Forest, identified some locations, and then also Nicole Engelman with Fish and Wildlife Service. So we went through the process of identifying some locations for putting those Huachuca spring snails that were captive raised back out onto landscapes. Right now, we're trying to repopulate a very low density population site in Scotia Canyon, and then a new site called Wakefield Spring up there on the flank of the mountains. And we've already done the genetics on those to find out that, oh, these are nearest neighbor populations. So they're probably, they would have historically been in those areas or might have been there in the past. So
Well, very exciting. That's great. We have a couple more questions. If you have populations of snails in your yard, are there ways that you can support them or things that you should avoid doing?
Well, even here in the Phoenix area, and I have a zero escape yard, I still have decollete snails that occasionally show up after it rains. And I was hoping to get rid of those, many years ago when I got rid of the Bermuda grass from the former previous owner. But they tend to be very persistent. Like I said, they're very good survivors, and they know how to hide, and they know how to, survive. Now, the garden snails and decollete snails, they're going to be in our urban landscapes and our ex-urban areas as well. It's the ones that are native that we're most interested in conserving. So I don't think you can ever be totally successful in trying to eradicate those invasive species that are in your front yards or backyards. Good luck though. I have some in my garden still. They're hard to get rid of.
Good to know, I guess. Another question, do snails hibernate in winter? Although that might have been missed because I think you talked about them going kind of dormant. So is it
Yes.
winter based or is it just dormancy based on drought?
So it's our understanding that the higher elevation talussnails, mountain snails, as well as woodland snails probably estivate during the wintertime when it's too cold. I've been up in the Huachucas in snowy weather and realized like they're not out and about. They're hunkered down. They're staying where it's nice and comfortable for them. So they're buried deep in their hibernacula and interstitial spaces. So the higher elevation land snails, they tend to estivate or sleep during the winter times. But the ones that are here in the Phoenix area in the lower elevations, they are actually very active in the wintertime. So last winter, we had some really good rainstorms, the winter rains in the Phoenix area. We went out to a couple sites under perfect weather conditions, and we had probably the world record number of Phoenix talussnails ever observed. We counted over 250 one morning at the Thunderbird Conservation Park, one of our desert mountain preserves. And so that was so neat. Probably, few of the folks that have ever lived have seen that many Phoenix talussnails alive, and so we were ecstatic about that.
That's awesome. That's great. We have another question about data gaps, particularly the northwestern New Mexico area. And do you know if it's just a data gap or is it a biogeographical absence of spring snails?
It's probably a data gap. A lot of folks, whether they're fisheries biologists, wildlife biologists, have overlooked these tiny snails. I know early in my career, only when we became aware of them about 20 years ago, it's like, oh, wow, we should have been looking for these, and right now I'm busy trying to get my colleagues with Game and Fish, as well as other partner agencies and NGOs to really be aware of them. And it's been paying off. Like I said, the last 6 years, we discovered 19 new populations. And it's amazing how many more sites there are out there. So getting out there to find them is key.
Kind of like that species effort, is the curve, is it curved like this? Like as you put in more effort, you're exponentially increasing, or are we kind of
I think there is a definite relationship. I think the rarity of a number of these species is only because we just haven't been out there looking for them. We haven't really documented where they're at. So.
Fantastic. We have one more question. Actually, we also have a note. If you do have snails in your yard and you also have chickens, you should feed the snails to the chickens. Yes. So I want to make sure that is verbalized so that everyone knows that they can participate in the food web there. Someone wants to know, how did you get interested in inverts?
Well, as an undergraduate at NAU, I took 2 semesters of invertebrate zoology. And while I was more interested in marine invertebrates and marine biology type stuff, working with Arizona Game and Fish, I was involved in a lot of primary productivity studies, looking at the food base for some of our native fish and sport fish communities on the Colorado River, and then some early trips through Grand Canyon. When the Kanab ambersnail project really kind of started up in the mid, 1995, I was hired in 1996 as the department's first full-time invertebrate biologist, and got to be privileged enough to be involved in that 1996, the first high experiment, the high flow that they had, the experimental flood. And so just working on the Kanab ambersnail project back then really kind of was like, wow, the more you learn about these things, the more you just, you really appreciate them. And really find that they're just fascinating. And then we picked up in the early 2000s a lot of our springsnail and talussnail projects. And only in the last 6 years, we've really just started exploring. My job duties, I'm focused. I'm the snail guy. I get to focus on snails. And so Arizona is my kind of playground. I get to go and explore. And I love sharing this with everybody who's interested. And it's kind of like a treasure hunt for this. I'm kind of in this same place that a lot of our big game biologists were about 100 to 150 years ago. We're just learning about this whole taxon group. And so that's exciting.
Very cool. That's
so
fantastic.
A lot of my interns I have over the years, I try to get them all excited about this and say, hey, there's opportunities for a graduate study work.
Speaking of an opportunity, it sounds like Kathleen would like to know if the area around Hallman Pond and Lopiano, or I don't know if I'm saying that right, Preserve, both in the Papago Park area, if those have been thoroughly explored.
They have not. In fact, actually, on March 21st, I'll be working with Mesa High School students and their teachers to go actually explore those areas for apple snails. And then that also, if we do find any pond snails or ramshorn snails, that's also a teaching opportunity to, get the students aware. And it's like, hey, wow. So yes, it's interesting that you said that, because those are two of the areas we're going to be targeting on March 21st.
That's great. That's awesome. Great to hear. Well, that's it for our questions in the chat, Jeff. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting, and it just feels like it's completely opened up my eyes when it comes to snails out here in the desert. So just thank you so much. If it's all right with you, we're going to share your contact info with folks so that they can send you snail photos, probably more than you want.
Yep. And if you do find any new live talus snails, I'm very interested in that as well, because that'll help us focus some efforts. So
fantastic. Cool. Yeah, and just thank you so much again. And I hope that you and everyone else has a wonderful afternoon.